Good evening. I'm Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum for a lively discussion of lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis that can be applied to challenges of national security today. So the topic is not just the history. In fact, we've had a number of other events here digging down on unanswered questions, but rather what we can learn from this history that might appropriately be applied to challenges we have today. And to participate in this, we have a host of stars, starting with my colleague Nick Burns. Nick is a professor of the practice of diplomacy here at the Kennedy School and was a star, indeed I would say, a leading light of his generation in the Foreign Service, the best of the best in American diplomats. He's also heading up here at the Kennedy School an initiative to try to revive diplomacy as the first line of defense, the first line for advancing and defending American interests. Our second participant that we were hoping to have today is stuck on an airplane right now, our colleague Sergei Khrushchev. It's unlikely that he shows up during the session, though we remain hopeful. But unfortunately, the weather has not been cooperative, and despite Patty Walsh's best efforts to be doing some redirecting, I'm not confident that he's going to appear, but I've brought some things that he would say, since on Sunday he was at a panel at the JFK Library in which Nick and I participated. But we also are going to have a chance to see and to hear a number of the people who actually participated in this historic event as key advisors to President Kennedy, who've appeared in earlier sessions here in the forum at the Kennedy School, reflecting on lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, including Bob McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense in this event, Ted Sorensen, who was the President's confidant and speechwriter, George Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor, all of whom have gone on to their just rewards, but who, fortunately, thanks to the video file that the forum has created, we'll get a chance to see and to hear. So, at the conclusion of this introductory part that we'll do with a combination of video clips plus conversation between Nick and myself, we're also going to announce the winners of the contest that was run jointly by Harvard's Belfer Center and Foreign Policy magazine for people to produce their own lessons of the missile crisis that they might apply to issues today. And there were three categories in which this contest was held: for professionals, for college students, and for high school students. And in each category there's a winner, and each category somebody wins a new iPad. So that'll be, you'll get a chance to see. If you participated in the contest, it might be you, okay? If you didn't participate in the contest, you can test your wits against people who actually did and who won. So today, the 19th of October, Friday, 50 years ago, where were we in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis? We were in the fourth day. You two had flown over Cuba on Monday. President learns about it on Tuesday, starts a set of deliberations Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, here Friday. So here we are, Friday the 19th. Actually, it's quite interesting. If you look, thanks to the secret tapes that Kennedy made of the deliberations, we have a pretty good window into what people were saying at these meetings. As you can be a fly on the wall and listen to them. And if you go to the Belfer Center's website, just belfercenter.org, the communications group has put up a wonderful tab on the Cuban Missile Crisis where you can see lessons that previous presidents drew, lessons that Secretaries of State have drawn, but also links to the audio files, which you can listen to, or to the transcripts, which you can read. So here, the 19th, that's Friday, 50 years ago, there's the meeting of the XCOM, at which, quote, Maxwell Taylor, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to Kennedy, quote, the chiefs are united on the military requirement for a massive airstrike against Cuba with no advance warning. Attack with the benefits of surprise those missiles and offensive weapons to prevent them from becoming operational. LeMay to JFK, quote, we don't have any choice except direct military action. Atchison, the former Secretary of State to JFK, quote, I feel that the course of action recommended to you by the chiefs from the military point of view is the right one, and I think it's the best one from the political point of view. Well, we could go on. So had that choice been made 50 years ago, we would not likely be here today. Now, this was the most dangerous moment in recorded history, and it plays out over the next, we're in the fourth day, the next remainder of 13 days. Let me just remind you of the picture very briefly, and then we'll get to the program. So, U-2 flies over Cuba, secret airplane, discovers missiles being constructed in Cuba. The 16th, the Tuesday morning, they tell the president they begin deliberating. Here we are on Friday, airstrike is where we want to go. By the following Tuesday, the 22nd, Kennedy announces to the world that the missiles have been discovered and that the U.S. is imposing a blockade demanding that the missiles be withdrawn. There's then a rush up to the edge of the precipice. On the 27th of October, the Saturday, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. People think that they're really on the brink of war, as we had a discussion with our former of the unanswered questions. Soviet military that night were told to go home, both in Cuba, where they'd been wearing civis, and in Moscow, to put on their uniforms because Soviet soldiers should die in their own uniform. The 28th, the morning, Khrushchev announces he's going to withdraw the missiles. So that's in a nutshell. Let's first hear what President, and here this picture is of President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the only occasion they ever met, which was in Vienna in 1961. But let's go first to, here's Kennedy announcing to the nation, 22 October 1962.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Our unswerving objective, therefore, must be to prevent the use of these missiles against this or any other country, and to secure their withdrawal or elimination from the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Okay, so listen carefully. We've discovered the missiles. The missiles have to be withdrawn, and if there's any attack from Cuba on the U.S. or any other part of the Western Hemisphere, what's going to happen? Requiring a full retaliatory response. That means nuclear war. Okay? So every president since Kennedy, or beginning with Kennedy, have thought about this set of events and drawn lessons. And as I say, you can find these, or summary of them, up on the website at thebelfercenter.org. One person who drew some lessons just 2 weeks ago and stated them at the UN General Assembly speech is the Israeli Prime Minister. So let's hear what he said.
Lead to war. Red lines prevent war. Just look at NATO's charter. It made clear that an attack on one member country would be considered an attack on all. And NATO's red line helped keep the peace in Europe for nearly half a century. President Kennedy set a red line during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That red line also prevented war and helped preserve the peace for decades. Where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here. Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb, before Iran gets to a point where it's a few months away or a few weeks away from amassing enough enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon.
Okay. So, Nick, you heard the message. Here's Cuba. Here's the current situation. Here's a red line. Here's NATO, as he said, draws a red line. Nick was at one stage of his career U.S. ambassador to NATO. Is Bibi correct?
I don't think Bibi's correct, but let me just say, first of all, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you all for being here. And I wanted to say a word about Professor Allison because he was nice in introducing me, and I haven't had a chance to say about him. He's the leading historian of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the most significant book, the most insightful book, the book that gave us our first understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis was published by Graham Allison. It's Essence of Decision, published in 1971. If you haven't read it, you have to read this book. I read this, I like to kid Graham, I read this book in college when I was a sophomore. and the other day I brought my vintage 1970 Boston College copy, and Graham was nice enough to autograph it for me. So I wanted to pay tribute to Graham Allison for his scholarship and leadership, and he's organized a very significant series of events to help us understand this commemoration. Let's talk about this, Graham. I have, just based on our own discussions over the last couple of weeks, I come away with 4 or 5 major takeaways when I think about the Cuban Missile Crisis and its application for today, for the challenges that the United States and the global community are facing. On the question of Iran, I think that President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu need to answer the same question that President Kennedy had to answer 50 years ago, this and next week. And the question is this: what are we trying to achieve here? Are we trying to achieve a total victory over our adversary? Or are we trying to achieve a situation where we stop short of war and both sides can walk away with their pride intact and believing that some kind of compromise has been made that allows them to have a peaceful resolution? And Kennedy's great insight, and I agree with Graham, hundreds of millions of people in the Soviet Union, in Europe, and the United States would likely have been killed in October 1962 if Kennedy had agreed with that recommendation 50 years ago today from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kennedy instead sought a deal, the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba, and the secret part of the deal was that the United States would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey some time after the crisis had elapsed. That was the key compromise at the very end, which Kennedy kept secret from many of those same cabinet officers around the table. And he did it almost alone with his brother and with Ted Sorensen in reaching this conclusion. So what's the application for today? If we want to avoid a war with Iran, but we also want to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, we're going to have to negotiate with Iran. If we draw the red line, with all due respect, where the Prime Minister has drawn it on this video a couple of weeks ago at the UN, the Prime Minister of Israel's red line is we're going to attack Iran when it achieves a certain level of nuclear capability, a certain line on the continuum of how much enrichment they've been able to process. President Obama's red line is very different. President Obama's red line is we're not going to actually use force, if we use it at all, until Iran acquires a nuclear weapon. President Obama is giving himself, as Kennedy did over those 13 days, more time and space to deliberate, to think about this, and hopefully to have a negotiation with the Iranians that would allow us both to walk away, Iran without a nuclear weapon or an ability to construct one, but the United States without entering into possibly a third major war in the Middle East in the last decade. So that's my primary takeaway.
Okay. I think that's an interesting one, but I think it certainly helps remind us that the missile crisis remains a lively part of the conversation about an issue like what should we do about Iran today, and we'll come back to Iran. President Kennedy was asked after the crisis to reflect on what he would have decided if he had decided, for example, today. That is 3 or 4 days into the crisis. If the conditions had been such that he had felt forced, for fear, let's say, of a leak, given the pervasiveness of the press and the pressure of time, to announce his decision before he had taken a while to deliberate, what might he have chosen? What would he have chosen? So let's hear what he said.
How does a president go about making a decision, like Cuba, for example?
The most recent one was hammered out really our policy and decision over a period of 5 or 6 days. During that period, the 15 people, more or less, who were directly frequently changed their view because whatever action we took had so many disadvantages to it. And each action that we took raised the prospect that it might escalate with the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. Finally, however, I think a general consensus developed and certainly seemed after all alternatives were examined that the course of action that we finally adopted was the right one. If we had had to act on the Wednesday in the first 24 hours, I don't think probably we would have chosen as prudently as we finally did.
So I had the chance last week to go out and look at the RFK papers, Robert Kennedy's personal papers from the crisis, which just opened after 50 years at the JFK Library. So you can go out there yourself and go look at them. And about these meetings, he makes his little marginalia on the intelligence briefing, or he writes his comments about what he thinks is going on. And not just in the first 48 hours, but on the Friday, Bobby is still of the view, we're going to attack. And there's in the file the speech that they had drafted. So if an announcement was going to be made, they had to have a speech ready to go. And here's the speech. I'll just read you a piece of it. He says, quote, as against the speech you heard on the 22nd. My fellow Americans, with a heavy heart and in necessary fulfillment of my oath of office, I have ordered, and the U.S. Air Force is currently carrying out, military operations with conventional weapons only to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup from the soil of Cuba. So again, think about it. And we actually have had a discussion of this the topic in a number of previous forums. If the rush of events had forced the president to choose before these deliberations. So let's hear what our former colleague Ernest May said about that in one of these forum deliberations.
I want to pick up for just a moment on what was just said, because it seems to me that one of the important and very difficult lessons from the crisis is that it did take time. It took time for people to work out the possibilities, to see options that they didn't see, even for President Kennedy to cool down, because he was prepared in the initial sessions to resort to an immediate attack. And that's, I say it's a difficult lesson because there is almost no chance that any president of the United States will have that leisure to deal with the crisis in future. And the importance of presidents and their advisors internalizing the lesson from this crisis that David Gergen was articulating to some students a couple of nights ago, that presidents just must not allow themselves to be hustled by the media into premature decisions. Say, I've got to think about the question.
Okay. So, Nick, you've seen decision processes that get rushed. You can see the extent to which today a pervasive press, 24/7 coverage, not just the responsible press, but everybody doing their... So, what about this? Yeah.
Well, when I just reflecting what President Kennedy was saying, and then when Professor May was saying at an earlier forum, it seems to me that one of the other takeaways of this crisis is we're really investing awesome responsibility in our presidents, and we're counting on them to be intelligent, to have great judgment, to be cool under pressure. And that's what Kennedy was. And the remarkable thing for me, and I'm not nearly the student of the crisis that Professor Allison is, but just reviewing it over the last couple of weeks, Kennedy had the courage of his convictions. And he was able to sit in a room with the most powerful type A personalities in the nation in 1962 and essentially say to all of them, I'm not going your way. I'm not going down this road towards war. I'm going to figure out a different way. And he figured it out, as we've talked about, with his brother Robert Kennedy, with Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter. And so as I reflect on our choice this year, we're going to elect a president in a couple of weeks, what are we looking for in our presidents? We've got to look for people with a real keen understanding and appreciation of history, a sense of other countries, their cultural and political sensibilities, a sense of geography, a sense of the balance of power, because you have to assess how strong is my adversary, how willing is my adversary to talk and maybe to make a deal. So when we look at these debates on Monday night, are we looking for the snappiest one-liner? Are we looking for the guy with the 5-point plan, the 3-point plan, the 1-point plan? Or are we looking for the person who we think in that kind of crisis, because these are the stakes for our country, is going to be as judicious, perceptive, cool, intelligent as Kennedy was? I think that's one of the factors that we need to look for in our president.
I agree entirely, and I think that makes the choice fateful. No?
It does.
But back to the specifics, just because I'm going to not let you off the hook on this one, because it's painful. On the one hand, openness and a press that reports on what goes on and everybody in the know has many attractions. But it's pretty clear, for me, from my study of the record, I think JFK's got it just right, that if they had felt that the force of events required them to move initially, the choice they would have made was the airstrike. It was only, as Ernie said, after thinking about it, listening to, well, if we do this, well, what are they going to do? And if they do that, what is going to happen? And then thinking, well, is there any other alternative? It took a deliberative process, a whole week, to invent something other than the initial instinct. Yeah. So if today we deny our president a week of private deliberation with people in a context in which he can change his mind, do we make it less likely that with intelligent choices?
We do, because we take away that luxury of just maybe a couple of days or a week for a president to exercise reason and judgment. So here's why I think Julian Assange is not right. Governments cannot afford, even in our era, where we need to be democratic and transparent, of course, to unveil everything to their publics. We have to have some capacity in some situations to maintain secrecy. If Kennedy had had to open up his deliberations on day 1 or 2 or 3 to the entire American public, he likely would have faced all sorts of political pressures, public pressures, that might have steered him in a different and maybe even a less satisfactory direction.
Or that he would have gone with his initial decision.
His emotion.
Yeah.
And Professor Allison wrote an account of President Obama's deliberations in the pursuit of Osama bin Laden for Time magazine. And as you reconstructed that event for Time magazine, what President Obama had the luxury, even in our 24/7 news cycle, he had months of secrecy where he could sit with his closest advisors and think about how do we get to Osama bin Laden, how do we neutralize that threat? If that story had been leaked to the New York Times or Washington Post or CBS on week 1 or 2, months before May 1st, 2011, would we have been able to get Osama bin Laden? The answer is certainly no,
Right.
because he would have been tipped off and his friends in Pakistan would have been able to secret him away. So governments have to be transparent and accountable, but sometimes when stakes are really high, governments have to operate behind closed doors.
Well, let me take another dimension of this, because one of the questions, again, that's been explored here in previous forums is how manageable are crises like this? So here in this instance, you have Kennedy and Khrushchev. You certainly have their attention. You have their key associates. But they are basically, in going to a crisis and confrontation, unleashing a lot of activity in their own government. So thousands of people are doing things, many times things that they're not even aware of. So how controllable or uncontrollable are these events? So let's hear Bob McNamara, a former Secretary of Defense, in the forum.
What I learned.
And this tape is an old tape, and so we may have a little problem with the video, but the audio evidently works well enough. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you might well ask, what have we learned? Ladies and gentlemen, I think you might well ask, what have we learned? We who participated in these 15 hours of discussion the last 2 days. And I think we've learned two things.
Well, we may
I want to.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you might well ask, what have we learned? We who participated in these 15 hours of discussion the last 2 days. And I think we've learned two things. First, you cannot manage a crisis, meaning a military confrontation between the two great powers or between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. There's absolutely no way. It is impossible to initiate action and do so with high confidence that you can predict the consequences of that action. What we have learned is, and I think this is true of the Soviets as well as ourselves, we cannot control these huge masses, these huge organizations, these military machines. And this is not because they're not disciplined, not at all. They are highly disciplined. It is simply that we are human. We are fallible. We are a function of misinformation, miscalculation, misjudgment, emotion in periods of crises. And I think that's the first point. You cannot manage a crisis with assurance that you can avoid unacceptable consequences. And therefore, the second lesson is you must learn to avoid crises.
Easier said than done.
So here's the former head of Ford Motor Company, the man who at one stage imagined that he controlled every nut and bolt in the whole Department of Defense, having lived through a crisis and thinking about what this actually meant. This is also a topic on which Ted Sorensen, who was, after Bobby Kennedy, the president's closest confidant, was a good friend of the Kennedy School, was his speechwriter, also reflected. So let's hear what Ted said here in the forum. Assuming that we can get our AV up.
As I recall, they would code. Well, they would translate it into Russian, put the Russian into code, and they would call up Western Union. There are probably a few people here who remember Western Union, who would send out Soviet embassy on 16th Street, as I recall. They would code. Well, they would translate it into Russian, to put the Russian into code, and they would call up Western Union. There are probably a few people here who remember Western Union, who would send out a young man on a bicycle. He would come and they would hand him the message. He would pedal back to Western Union. They would send it to Western Union Moscow, who would send it on a bicycle to the Kremlin and Mr. Khrushchev. All this taking an enormous amount of time. And Dobrynin added, we hoped the young man didn't have a girlfriend in our neighborhood. There was even one such incident during the 13 days. It was on that very Saturday when we had all the bad news. I told you, it looked like we were losing on the diplomatic track with the second letter, losing on the information track because one of our U-2s was shot down, and the chiefs insisted that we retaliate by bombing the Soviet SAM site that shot it down. Everything was just on the edge of breaking into war when a message came in that a U.S. Air Force plane, I think based in Alaska, had been sent out on an air sampling mission in order to test the air to find out if the Soviets were testing their nuclear weapons. The truth of the matter is we were testing our nuclear weapons. And this Air Force plane flying over the pole, hard to get lost, there's only one direction to go from the North Pole, but his navigation controls malfunctioned and he flew out over Siberia. A U.S. Air Force plane flying out over Soviet territory. This was read aloud in XCOM, and there was stunned silence until the president, never losing his sense of humor, broke the silence saying, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the message.
Okay, so, I mean, if you were doing a movie script, I think this would probably be rejected. Well, I don't know, but today they're so incredible, maybe it would get in. But on the final Saturday of the crisis, everybody's on the edge of the precipice. Two U-2s, in effect, go on odd missions. One goes over Cuba and is shot down. Khrushchev is not aware that the orders that he previously gave are now able to be executed because the surface-to-air missiles in Cuba have become operational. So when it happens, he's shocked. Kennedy gets the notice that another U.S. U-2 happens to be flying over the Soviet Union at this moment. And Khrushchev then writes, after the crisis, a wonderful letter. Khrushchev, actually, I'd say, has the best lines in the crisis, in these letters. He writes a letter to him that says, Mr. President, what are we to think is happening? We find, at the moment of the crisis, a U-2 flying over the Soviet Union, and people tell me it's taking a last look at targets before you attack us. And he says, quote, Mr. President, we and you ought not now pull on the end of the rope in which you've tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied, and there'll come a time when the people who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. So what about, Nick, you've seen a few crises in your life and the extent to which things are controllable or not controllable. What would you say about this?
Obviously a harrowing moment. I guess I have two thoughts, Graham. First is governments are sometimes ungovernable. These are massive governments. They had several million military and civilian personnel in both of them. It's very difficult to control different departments of your government when they're operating on autopilot, or in this case, according to established procedure. And the people down the line, 3 or 4 levels below in Alaska, don't understand completely what the Secretary of Defense and the President are trying to do. And this could have had, unbelievably horrific consequences, this standard operating procedure. So sometimes it's just very difficult to control a massive bureaucracy. Second thought is, great presidents, great secretaries of state and defense are able to do two things. They're able to be great strategists and great tacticians. They're strong on establishing a vision and a policy, but they're also strong on making the trains run on time. And in my career, I had a chance to work for Democratic and Republican administrations. There was just one person who stood out to me as a paragon of virtue in this regard. It was James A. Baker III, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State. And I have some students from my modern diplomacy class here, and we study him. Because
and you had him here last spring.
We had Secretary Baker here for a day with the law school and business school as our guest. We named him our great negotiator of 2012 because, on the one hand, President George H.W. Bush and Secretary Baker were really superb in establishing strategy and being clear about it. But Baker was superb about making the U.S. government run, and run on a tight line, and actually do what the president wanted the government to do. And if you don't have that type of person who combines strategy and tactics, Richard C. Holbrooke was another person who had this gift for intellectualism, but also a gift for managing people and governments. If you don't have those types of people, then the government's just not simply going to do what you think it's going to do. And Kennedy and Khrushchev were both, in a sense, victims of their own bureaucracies, and it could have skewered the entire strategy.
As I've thought about this one afterwards, I would say that both Bundy and McNamara are absolutely got their finger on the pulse of something crucial here. That as you see this crisis mounting, on the 27th and 28th, both Kennedy and Khrushchev have the sense that they've unleashed processes that they are trying their best to control, but in which inevitably uncontrollable things are happening. And that those uncontrollable things may actually ultimately lead in nuclear bombs exploding on their territory. Yeah. So this sense of the loss of control actually is part of what gets them into the frame of mind to find we got to find some way out of this thing, because it's otherwise going to just, I mean, if Khrushchev had responded to the U-2 over Cuba by taking down the airplane, which is what was the impulse. You got a U-2 flying over your country. If you can shoot it down, shoot it down. Yeah. And we had responded. Go down that path, and you can see what happens. We had responded to the shoot down of the U.S. U-2 over Cuba the way that the orders had been given. Kennedy had previously given orders to do this. McNamara said, well, maybe we should wait a little bit. Okay? So you can see how this was sort of getting out of control. We're going to go just in 5 minutes to the audience on lessons in which, if you didn't get a chance to do your own proposed lesson, you can offer one if it's quick. You can offer questions, but one, to get us started on questions, a topic that we've taken up here before, let's hear McGeorge Bundy's lesson. McGeorge Bundy was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences here at Harvard, who then was chosen by President Kennedy as his national security advisor. So how about Bundy?
What I learned from all this reinforces a conclusion that many of us have reached, and not just those of us who participated in this particular crisis, that one of the great keys to the avoidance of danger in the nuclear age is to understand what is and what is not a vital interest to your opponent, and to understand the importance of his understanding what is a vital interest to you. I think that in one sense, what we have been learning in the last 2 days is that with more sighted, better informed governments, more able to communicate with each other openly and honestly, the Cuban Missile Crisis need never have happened.
So Bundy's lesson is the importance of being clear about vital interests as opposed to other interests that are important but are just not quite vital. What about that, Nick?
I think it's absolutely right. Nations usually do not and should not go to war for interests that are merely important. A vital interest is a threat that would actually threaten the very existence of the country or cause enormous damage to the country and loss of life. And it's in distinguishing those two different sets of interests that's where presidents have to make their most vital contribution. I think in this respect, Graham, and you've written about this, the role of Robert Kennedy is critical in this process, because if you think of Bundy's quote, Robert Kennedy had a series of conversations with Anatoly Dobrynin, the very new ambassador to Washington at the time, and with another Soviet I think, intelligence official in Washington.
Bolshakov, yeah.
And it was through those two sets of conversations, I think, that Robert Kennedy was able to divine what is truly vital to Khrushchev. And John F. Kennedy had to have a keen appreciation of that in order to decide, how do we get out of this crisis? What's the deal? And again, to go to our lessons for 2012 and 13, whether it's President Obama or President Romney, there could be a day or a week, a year from now, where we have to make a decision, do we go to war with Iran? And I hope very much that before we make that decision, we've exhausted diplomacy, and we've taken a good hard look, what are the vital interests of Iran, and where is the space where we might make an agreement with Iran to stop them short of a nuclear weapon, but stop us short of a catastrophic, potentially, war. So I think the Cuban Missile Crisis has some direct lessons for us today.
I agree. Let's hear JFK's lesson. JFK's major takeaway he delivered in his, I would say, greatest foreign policy speech at the American University commencement in June of 1963. So let's just hear a little clip from that, if we can.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal. We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war.
Okay. So what's the main lesson from Kennedy's point of view? I just stated again that nuclear powers must avert confrontations, not manage them, avert confrontations that bring an adversary to a binary choice between humiliating retreat and war. So if we try to think about Iran and the Iranian nuclear challenge today, I've written about it as a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. So not over 13 days are we going to get to the brink, but I'd say the next 13 months is a pretty good timeline. And in the 13 days, on the final Saturday, the 27th of October, so 10 days from now, Kennedy was given by his advisors two and only two options. Attack the missiles to prevent them from coming ready to fire against the U.S., or acquiesce in Khrushchev having established a defensive strategic nuclear base in Cuba. That's it. You can go, as I said before, listen to the tapes, go to the website. It's terrific fun to listen to people debating choices they thought would likely, some of which would lead to nuclear war, and maybe they could find an alternative. Attacked, well, but if we attack the missiles in Cuba, could any of them be fired? Well, if they're operational, they might. And in any case, will this be the end of the game, or will Khrushchev attack our missiles in Turkey, or will he move against Berlin? Well, how about acquiesce? Well, Kennedy's just said publicly, this cannot stand. There's a very bright red line there. Similarly, he's thinking about next month, Berlin, where Khrushchev has said he's going to solve the Berlin problem. And now we know, after the fact that we've learned a lot of more facts about the Soviet side of this, that he was thinking he was going to finish construction of the missiles in October, unveil them in November, and propose a solution on Berlin. And there, Khrushchev held all the cards, because Berlin was at the time this enclave, a free enclave in the midst of Soviet troop-occupied East Germany. And the U.S. was committed to defending Berlin, up to and including nuclear weapons. Well, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And that's when, in that setting, Kennedy becomes extremely inventive. And you've already said something about that, Nick, so say whatever.
Well, I agree with you. I think this is an extraordinary speech, this American University speech. And if you haven't read it, read it. Go on our websites and watch the speech. Think about it. I think it's actually the most important speech given by an American president in the last half century. Because he does say in that speech that the human interest has to transcend the national interest. And that was his basic choice. Am I really trying to just maximize the position of the United States in October 1962 versus the USSR? Or do I understand we live in a small planet, we all breathe the same air, we've got to save humanity, which he ultimately, thankfully, brilliantly decided to do. And he says in this speech, we need a strategy for peace. In fact, that's the title of the speech, not just for war. And I can tell you, having served in the U.S. government, we've got a million strategies for war. We have to, you know, contingency plans in case we get into trouble. How many strategies of peace do we have? And we've talked about this before. Kennedy regularly said our highest national aspiration has to be peace. And even people like Lyndon Johnson said that, and Richard Nixon said that in 1968. Where is the American leader now? Where are the foreign leaders saying our highest aspiration is peace? Most of our leaders say our highest aspiration is security. There's got to be something beyond security if we're going to uphold our responsibilities. This is a great speech. And I think, Graham, you're right. If you frame the Iran problem in 2013, okay, here's the choice. Either we bomb Iran or we contain them. We fight them or we acquiesce to an Iranian nuclear weapon. It's the wrong framework. Because there's a huge space in the middle between those two alternatives called our intelligence, our wit, diplomacy. Might we, not assuredly, but might we find a path to peace on our terms where they don't get a nuclear weapon? That's where I think President Obama is heading. And I'm convinced that if he is reelected, he's going to choose a big negotiation with Iran before he even considers the use of force. And we'll have to restrain Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we should, while protecting Israel's interests, obviously. But to me, that's the central lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay. Before we open it to questions, and you can even start lining up, because this is just going to take 1 minute, let me announce who the three winners are, and let's put them up here. The first category is grades 6 to 12, and the winner is Eden Rose Niles from Denver, Colorado. Great. And her lesson is, let me quote it for you here. During a crisis, when military action is viable as a first response, the morality of using weapons to reach a resolution must be considered in order to prevent a catalyst for greater conflict and subsequent death. So, good for Eden.
Very smart.
The winner in the general public category is Zachary Elias of Dartmouth College in Hanover, Virginia. No,
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Who said Virginia? New Hampshire. The lesson, the Cuban Missile Crisis taught the U.S. what containment feels like. There's 300 words explaining more details of that up on the website that you can look at. And in the third category, the scholar practitioners, the winner is Reed Pauley, who's a research assistant at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And his lesson is multilateralism is the key. So if you fail to win, you can tell us your lesson, though there's no more iPads on offer. There are 2 microphones here on the floor, and there are microphones at the first loge. So please stand up, offer your 2 cents worth, and introduce yourself. Comments are in order, as well as questions, and let me start with Dan Finn, who was one of the people who worked as an assistant to President Kennedy, even at the time. Dan.
Yes, thank you, Graham. Let me hasten to say that although I was there, part of total White House staff, this is hard to believe, of 77. That was the entire White House complement at the time. Slight change since those days. I was not in any sense a participant in the crisis, as Graham well knows, because he would have talked to me long since if I had been. But I
interviewed you about other things, but not about the crisis.
That's right. That's right. But I was in that White House at the time, and I've thought a lot about it, and I've talked to a lot of my colleagues about it since. There's one aspect of the crisis, which is really the aftermath of the crisis, which doesn't get much notice. We sometimes forget that the Cuban Missile Crisis took place about 10 days before critical midterm elections in 1962. And the obvious, and it was obvious to a lot of people, that the thing to do is to crow about this and to say this is a great victory. And as a matter of fact, one of his advisors did say we went eyeball to eyeball and the other fellow blinked. The day after, and I just happily have to have the quote here, the day after Khrushchev accepted the trade, although not publicly, Kennedy went to his press secretary and he said this to him: "This is not our victory. This is a joint victory of two nations. We did it together. Don't let anyone go out there and say this was an American victory." And in explaining his position on that and in enforcing it on his own people, he said, look, Khrushchev has his hardliners too, and we don't want to put him in a situation any worse than he's already in, because he was looking forward to dealing with them on the test ban treaty.
Good, thank you, Dan. And actually, if Sergei Khrushchev were here, what he said at the JFK Library on Sunday was echoed that precisely, saying that this was a joint victory in the sense that both having got into this situation, that's one story, but once in it, it took both parties being prepared to compromise to get out of it. Yeah. Please, sir.
I'm Charlie Clements of the Carr Center here. I was 16 at the time. I was living on a Air Force base in Texas that had B-52s. My father was a nuclear weapons officer. And on not this Friday, but it must have been the subsequent Friday, we knew that all the B-52s had been loaded with nuclear weapons. They had all taken off with double crews, and our B-52s were flying a racetrack pattern over Alaska. They would fly straight toward the Soviet Union, at the last minute turn around and come back. And my father told her that morning, that Friday, that she should take us down the road about 50 miles to Bastrop and get a motel for 3 days, because he feared that our base was going to be targeted by the Soviets. My father had never mentioned anything about his work before as we were growing up. Now, I was 16. I had a football game on Saturday. I didn't want to go down the road. I figured that the football game was more important than the chance of a strike against our air base. But my question to you is that it seems like a critical lesson here that we only learned over decades was not to act as if we have full information. Because as I understand it, we gradually learned that we thought the missiles were not actually loaded with nuclear weapons. We later learned that they were loaded with nuclear weapons. We assumed that the Soviets had battlefield control. Later we learned that the Cubans actually were given battlefield control and had the authority to fire them themselves. So it sounds like that what Maxwell Taylor, what General Curtis LeMay, and what McNamara were operating on was very faulty information, but they were acting as if they had full information. So that's my question to you.
Well, it's a good question, and actually a great vignette about the B-52s, and there's hundreds of similar stories. So it was actually the case that since President Kennedy ordered U.S. forces to what's called DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2. Defense Condition 1 is war, okay? So just to the edge of war. That triggers thousands of routines in which B-52s are loaded with active nuclear bombs. They fly towards the Soviet Union. Bombs are loaded on fighter aircraft in Europe, flown by Germans and by Turks, who are ready, if they take off at their own initiative, to go and drop a bomb. Nothing could have prevented them. So they had, at the time, there were no electronic locks, so that didn't require some additional code. So if a pilot sitting on an aircraft, on a runway in Germany or in Turkey had taken off, he could fly to wherever he could get to in the Soviet Union and drop a bomb, and now you're into a war. So the proposition that there were quite a lot of things that were unknown, including, for example, as people were arguing for the attack, the speech I read to you, which would have been followed by an invasion, they would have been surprised by the fact that they didn't know that the Soviet forces there had brought with them tactical nuclear weapons. So they didn't not only have strategic nuclear weapons, but tactical nuclear weapons, which would have been used against the beachhead as U.S. forces were landing. So that's yet another trail. So there are quite a lot of trails from this set of events through actions that neither the president nor the chairman of the Soviet Union were controlling that would have led to nuclear war.
Charlie, it's a great question, and my contribution to this, following Graham, would be just to say it's so important in a crisis to give our leadership some space and time, if that's possible. You know, if your back's not to the wall and you don't have to respond, what President Kennedy was trying to do is play for a little time here, because you're exactly right. First reports, second reports, third reports are invariably not correct, or they conflict with each other. And, you know, I'm reminded of that because I've been thinking a lot over the last couple of days about what happened in Benghazi. These tragic events last month on September 11th and 12th of 2012. You know, when we're arguing right now in our presidential campaign, well, what happened, and should the president have said this or that? I just think, knowing the enormous pressure that our presidents are under, we ought to be a little bit charitable toward them. Act with a little bit of forbearance. Understand that the first reports come in where you think you've established the truth on day 1 or 2. On day 10 might be incorrect. And then a different explanation emerges. And this makes perfect sense to me as a student of history, but also someone who has been in government. Yeah. And, you know, in our media-driven political culture, we expect our presidents to be brilliant on the first second of a crisis,
and
everything is figured out. Yeah. Secretary George Marshall, one of the great leaders the United States has ever produced, used to say to his staff, he was chief of staff of the Army during the Second World War. He ran the Roosevelt and Stimson. He used to say to his staff, tell me how I might be wrong. Let's have a little humility here. Let's understand in the fog of battle or the fog of a crisis, we don't perceive everything to be happening. And in Libya, let's be a little bit charitable to our president. That's what I think.
Quite fair. This gentleman, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Aaron Markowitz. I'm a freshman at the college. And I think that my question is really directed towards Professor Burns specifically, but I suppose both of you would agree that a nation should only be going to war or consider that as an option if it's in the nation's vital interests are at stake, basically. I think that that's a reality, but if a regime such as Iran, when you try to draw these parallels to the Cuban Missile Crisis, should Iran consider its acquisition of a nuclear weapon in the vital interests of that regime, it seems that the common ground for diplomacy begins to run thin. So where would you believe the practical common ground would be in terms of a diplomatic solution between our and certainly Israel's vital interests in preventing acquisition of a nuclear weapon and then Iran's perception of vital interests in securing their regime with a nuclear weapon? Thank you.
Good question.
Thank you for your question. It's a great question. I think Graham and I will both have thoughts on it since we talk about it all the time. I think we do have vital interests at stake if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon or several nuclear weapons. Number one is the threat to Israel. Israel's our friend and ally. Number two, the United States does not want to see a situation where Iran becomes the dominant military power in the Middle East because the Middle East itself, for economic and strategic reasons, is vital to us. And number three, and President Obama articulated this in March when he gave his speech to AIPAC, if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, it is very likely that other countries, and the President did not name them, but I would, just my own view would be Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia might decide to become nuclear weapons powers themselves, and in the tinderbox of the Middle East, it is definitely in our vital interest to prevent a proliferation of nuclear weapon states. So I think this is the most important national security decision for 2012 and 13. What do we do about Iran? It's a great threat to us, as well as to Israel, as well as to the Arab states, particularly the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the others. And that does raise the stakes for us. And it means that we have to make the best possible decision in order to avert war, if that's possible.
I just make a footnote going back to the missile crisis. I think if we take the Kennedy lesson and ask, what would JFK do? And if you think of this attack, acquiesce, bifurcated choice, which is what I think we'll come to at some point down the current path, maybe over the next year or so, Kennedy in this last moment on the 27th refused the two choices because he thought the first one was impossible in the sense that it was likely to lead to nuclear war, and the second one was likely to lead to nuclear war. So in that moment, in part out of desperation, but in part because it sort of clarified things. Here's the reality of the situation. And in fact, it's very interesting, as I say, you can go listen to the tape yourself or read the transcript, and you can see very smart people struggling with this, and they can't, well, you can either have to do this or you have to do that. That's it. And in that moment, he becomes inventive and comes up with this very strange concoction that includes a public deal, a private ultimatum, and a secret sweetener. So the public deal is you withdraw the missiles from Cuba, and we will pledge not to invade Cuba. Okay? Well, that seems okay. Privately, we need to hear within 24 hours that you're withdrawing these missiles from Cuba, or we're going to act unilaterally to resolve this problem, which meant attack. Well, my goodness, giving somebody a military ultimatum, that's pretty unusual, but privately, not publicly. And then secretly, Bobby said to Dobrynin, this is the way the message went that Sorensen was talking about, we're not going to make a quid pro quo, he said, but if the missiles are withdrawn from Cuba, within 6 months, the U.S. missiles in Turkey, which you've been asking for, will be gone. But that's going to be secret. Well, that was the deal. So I would say on the Iran thing, now's a good time to start becoming inventive, and actually we can all participate in this game.
Right.
What is there between attack and acquiesce that might meet our vital interests, just to your question, and might also meet Iran's interests? Now, there may be nothing in that space, and even if there is, the two parties may not be smart enough to find a way to agree on it. But I think that's the challenge. This lady.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah. I'm a freshman at the college. During our talk, you mentioned the need to keep some information away from the public. What criteria do you think should be used to mark the line between what should be told to the public in the interest of transparency and what should be kept away in the interest of diplomacy, perhaps? Do you think there are any lessons from the Cuban crisis in this regard?
That's another great question. Nick was, in another stage of his career, the press spokesman for the State Department for Madeleine Albright. So, Nick, I'll give that to you.
All right. Great question. You know, we live in a democratic society, so we have to err on the side of being open to our public and transparent. So we classified information, secret information, on a 30-year timeline. When you classify a document that's secret, it will not see the light of day in Harvard University or any library for 30 years. President Obama came into office and said we ought to shorten that. We ought to give our citizens the right to look at our government more carefully on a shorter timeline. And he and President Bush, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton have tried to open up the government a little bit so that our citizens can see exactly what's happening. And that, in a democratic society, is critical. But there's got to be a small space reserved for secrecy. And here's my argument against, the Julian Assanges of the world who say, well, why don't you just publish all your documents, every diplomatic cable? I used to say to reporters, they used to harangue me, why don't you tell us more? I'd say, my government have a right to secrecy? No, you got to tell us everything. I'd say, how about the nuclear codes? What do you mean? Well, we have codes that activate our nuclear weapons. Do you think, you reporters, that we ought to make those public? Well, of course not. I would say, I've therefore established the right of the government to have secrets. So, in this case, as Professor Allison and I have discussed, the president had the relative luxury of 13 days. If he'd had 3 days because someone had gone to the Washington Post on October 18th or 19th of 1962, he might very well have made a different decision. He might very well have wandered into conflict, into war. And I think, the stakes are so high. If you think about terrorism, WMD, nuclear, chemical, and biological weaponry, think about the consequences of a U.S.-Chinese clash, two nuclear superpowers, if we had a misunderstanding over the South China Sea or the Senkaku Islands. You want to give space to your presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens, the rulers of the world, and preserving some secrecy about some deliberations is absolutely critical, in my view.
This gentleman.
Glenn Ingram, a student of history. I was intrigued by a Globe correspondent, an article this week by Jordan Michael Smith mentioning with this sort of like sensationalized headline, "Did a mistake save the world?" I'm curious to your views on Kennedy's reading of Barbara Tuchman's book about how World War I started, which historians have now sort of debunked her theory of the start as being an accident, and yet he used that apparently as a bit of backdrop reading during the context to further his notion of not wanting to go down that road of something happening accidentally. I'm just curious about your views on his use of that book and the
I'll give it 2 cents because, again, given that the time would be brief, but I'd be happy to talk about it after. First, I don't agree with the revisionism about the Barbara Tuchman thesis. I like the Tuchman book a lot. I think that the proposition that for the absence of a crystal ball that would have allowed them to see where they would be at the end of World War I, many of the statesmen took actions which, if they had been able to foresee the future, they would never have taken. So at the end of World War I, everyone lost. So the Kaiser, who in the revisionist thing was the tough guy, is gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, who were the implementers, dissolved. The Tsar, who backed them up, overturned by communists and the Bolsheviks. France bled such that it hardly ever recovered. Britain lost the flower of its youth. So I'd say, after the fact, this was a disaster for all of the parties. And the lesson that Kennedy kept thinking about was, from thinking about the Tuchman book, wait a minute. People can end up going to war and ending with a result that after the fact they would have never chosen. So let's keep thinking about that, and that they set in motion processes. This is what McNamara was talking about earlier. You set in motion these processes, and then they have some momentum of their own, or they are initiatives that are. So I would say that seems to me, that certainly was seared in Kennedy's mind, and he talked to his brother about this on several different occasions during the crisis, and to others, thinking, I've been thinking about this book. So I like the thesis of the book, though I agree, the historians are now having fun, and historians love revising things over and over. You're a historian, so you're familiar with that. This gentleman.
Hi there. I'm Jesse, and I'm a freshman at the college.
Great.
So I have a question about where you guys think nuclear power is going in the future, and how we can reduce the number of nuclear weapons to zero. So there's been a resurgence online right now of awareness about this issue. If you Google Global Zero, all sorts of information on the topic. But I wanted to know what you think of the last couple decades' efforts and the best possible methods for the future.
Well, you're looking at Professor Allison and Professor Bunn are two of the great experts in the United States on this issue. I'm going to defer to Graham. I'll just say one sentence. We're not in good shape. we're not winning the war against proliferation. North Korea, run by a 28-year-old previously unemployed third son with no management experience, is the proud owner of a nuclear weapons force. And if we're not smart and tough, the Iranians will get a nuclear weapon. And India and Pakistan are at each other's throats, and they're both nuclear weapons powers. So this is, I think, the greatest threat to the human race. That, you know, at some point, somebody's going to make a mistake, or some terrorist group's going to get its hands on WMD, and there's going to be a catastrophe. And I don't mean to depress you on a Friday afternoon, but those are the stakes, and you really have, and Professor Allison, Professor Bundy seated in the front row, and the Belfer Center, I think, our greatest repository of wisdom, the two of them.
Well, thank you, Nick. I'd say look at the Belfer Center website, since this is a topic we debate and discuss a lot. The fact that, I think your instinct, the reason for thinking it's appropriate, is that 4 of the wisest statesmen of the Cold War, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Bill Perry, and George Shultz, have now, over the last 2 years, embraced the idea, the vision, of a world free of nuclear weapons, and urged an agenda of actions for moving towards there in a smart but rapid fashion. And President Obama, in his famous Prague speech in April of 2009, in his first year, endorsed this vision as well. So the initial steps taken in the New START treaty would bring the U.S. and Russia down to 2,250 active nuclear weapons in their active arsenal. That's a huge step from, if we try to remember, at the height of the Cold War, between us we had about 64,000 nuclear weapons. Again, it's, you know, obscene and absurd, but still, that was a fact. So this is going in the right direction for sure. The problem, the fundamental problem, is the one that Nick points to, which is that, lo and behold, other parties are getting nuclear weapons. Some parties that haven't had their Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you want to think of who are the best candidates for a nuclear war today, India and Pakistan. How plausible is it that they might find themselves eyeball to eyeball? Well, excuse me, they've had 4 wars, so this wouldn't be too hard. And in the North Korean case, another problem. And Pakistan has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world. So this is a great agenda for a freshman to work on. So I'd be happy to talk about it after. This gentleman will have to get the last question. And then for those of you that are up for questions, Nick and I will stand here and talk right after, but please.
Hi, my name is Leon Ratz. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. So my question is about empathy. Robert McNamara discussed empathy as one of his 11 lessons in Fog of War. He said it was only when the Americans started thinking like the Soviets, when President Kennedy consulted with Ambassador Thompson, who knew Khrushchev personally, did we start moving towards a resolution in the crisis. So when we think of national security crises today, when we think of the situation with Iran, do we need to do more to think like the adversary, to understand the adversary's interests, their fears, and their motivations?
Extremely good question. And actually, we had another clip which we didn't use just because there's been so many fantastic forums. This one was from Bobby Kennedy, not in the forum, because unfortunately he was gone before the forum was here, but from another setting in which his lesson is just your lesson. He said the most important thing that he was taking about this after, to think about empathy that would have allowed the U.S. to better understand what were the conditions that might have led Khrushchev to do such a wild thing. Now, when you think of it after, well, why might somebody like Khrushchev have taken an action like this? Well, so Kennedy's elected. He's run against Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, on the grounds that the prior administration didn't do anything. So we got to get the country moving. And in particular, they let the Soviets have a huge nuclear advantage over us. There was the missile gap. That was the big item. If you look at the Kennedy Nixon debates, which you can see on the web or out at the library. They're accusing Nixon to be part of an administration that allowed a missile gap to open. And Kennedy said he's going to close that missile gap. Well, lo and behold, he becomes president. Now he gets a full set of briefings. And actually, the U.S. has a huge advantage over the Soviet Union in nuclear weapons, not a disadvantage. But he's already campaigned on this, and so he orders an even greater buildup. So the U.S. spurts, starting in 1961. You look at the lines. We start building Minuteman missiles, Polaris submarines, okay. So Khrushchev had previously decided that the ICBMs that they had that would deliver warheads against American targets were not working as well as they should, and was waiting on the purchase of a different weapon system that would be 3 or 4 years down the line. But there was going to open what we came to think of during the Reagan years of the Cold War, what became to be popular in the American culture as the, quote, window of vulnerability, was the point which your enemy is so strong relative to you that if he attacked first, he might even think he could disarm you. And that could give him some leverage. So I would say that's one of the conditions that Khrushchev was living in, right? Just as a for example. Secondly, here is Cuba and Castro. And actually, we had another clip for you tonight that we'll put up on the website from Castro. Who is that? Okay. In 1960, he came to Harvard. He was so popular that he had to appear in the Harvard Stadium. There was no forum then. He was introduced by McGeorge Bundy. Wow. Think of that. He was the. Okay.
Were you here for that?
No, I hadn't even got to Harvard yet. Okay. So in any case, you can go see that. Okay. So Castro. Castro is the communist bastion, a beachhead, only example of a communist country in this Cold War competition in the Western Hemisphere. And he's a thorn in Kennedy's side. So Kennedy is elected, and in April, he authorizes the Bay of Pigs, which was an invasion of Cuba by Cuban immigrants directed and supported by CIA to overthrow Castro. And Kennedy then, for whatever reason, gets halfway into it, but is not prepared to follow up with American forces because it was supposed to be a covert action. Good luck, okay? The guys get captured. It's a disaster. So by the time Kennedy gets to the missile crisis, he's a failed foreign policy president, if you go back to it. But in any case, from Khrushchev's point of view and Castro, the thought is, these guys don't like me. And they might take military action against me to do me in. Because in the Cold War, that's the way the game was played. So again, could that be a concern for Khrushchev? Certainly a concern for Castro. So Bobby Kennedy's lesson about empathy to try to think about what are the circumstances that might lead somebody to do something that you don't really want them to do. I mean, I think if I want to apply this just one more step. So how might this apply to the U.S.-Chinese relationship today? Just to take another example. So you think, there's all of this debate with the Chinese between them and all their neighbors. The Japanese over the Senkakus, the Philippines over some different islands, the Vietnamese over some different islands, the Indonesians over some different islands. And the Americans say, well, why don't you let us help sort it out? As my Chinese friends say, do you know where these islands are located? I guess. Okay. What is it called? This place where these islands are. Somehow, somebody named it the China Sea. It's called the South China Sea, the East China Sea. So you're going to come and help resolve these. Yes, and we could help sort this out. So I say, well, let's at least think, how would Teddy Roosevelt, so go back just 100 years now. So America, you have a Harvard American president, Teddy Roosevelt. So let's imagine it's 1910 or 11, okay? American century he was confident about. Maybe a Chinese might think something's happening in the 21st century. So when the British proposed to help sort out the debates on the territorial debates with Venezuela, what did Teddy Roosevelt say? Thank you very much. You guys have been providing freedom of the sea for 100 years. We should be thankful to you. He said, get the hell out of here. This is our hemisphere. We'll settle this. The Hondurans, he wanted to build a canal. They wouldn't give him a contract for the canal. We sponsored a coup. New country was born. It was called Panama. We recognized it within 12 hours. Within 24 hours, they had signed a deal for the Panama Canal. That's how the canal was built. There's a dispute over Canada, over the tail of what's now Alaska. If you look at Alaska, there's this tail that runs down that separates Canada Sea. How did that come to be? The Canadians said, that's our territory. We said, no, that's our territory. So there was a dispute. And the British said, well, Canada's our colony, so we have a role in this. And Teddy Roosevelt said, forget about it, butt out, okay? And Taft said to him, well, we should let this be settled by international arbitration. Roosevelt said, what? What does the international people have to do with this? Taft said, well, how about, here's the deal. We'll have it done by international arbitration. There'll be 5 arbitrators, and you get to choose 3. He said, as long as it's by majority vote, that's okay. He chose his 3. There was one meeting. They voted for his resolution. We got this tail, okay? So I would say, if we tried to be empathetic about the Chinese today, we would say, well, this is a pretty big issue, pretty complicated issue, and we might be more reserved. Nick, what do you say about that? I'll give you the last word.
All right. Well, to pick up on Professor Allison's tour of American diplomatic history, just to show what a peaceful country we are, if you can picture the Oval Office, the Roosevelt Room, named for the 2 Harvard graduates Roosevelt's became president, is right outside the Oval Office. It's
named for Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, and it sits right beside the president's office.
And so we would normally, when a foreign leader comes to the White House, if the president's not immediately available, we'll have a foreign minister in the Roosevelt Room. I remember being in there with one of our secretaries of state, and there you have the battle flags of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and the standards of all the battles they've fought going back throughout American history, and there's hundreds of conflicts memorialized on these battle standards. And this one particular Secretary of State, whom I probably shouldn't name, used to joke with every foreign minister. He would describe all these great battles just to show you what a peaceful country we are in American history.
These are only the ones that we won.
Well, of course. But I think Leon's question, and we're going to finish on this.
Yes.
Leon's question brings us, it's a perfect question. It brings us back to where you and I started. So what do we take away from the Cuban Missile Crisis? Lots of lessons. I think the central one, for those of us who want to see the United States act with strength, but act with some empathy towards the rest of the world, and always try to resolve conflicts peacefully if we possibly can, and only use force not as a first impulse, last resort. What is it? It's what Leon said, it's what Robert Kennedy said. You need in diplomacy to understand the person across the table, his or her history, culture, experience. Yitzhak Rabin used to say, hard-bitten, tough Israeli prime minister, you don't negotiate with your best friends. He said, you negotiate with very unsavory enemies. And if you don't transport yourself into their culture, their geostrategic situation, their political problems at home, and have a sense of them, you're not going to be successful, usually, in figuring out a way to avoid war and have some kind of a settlement that allows us both to walk away with our pride intact. And Khrushchev and Kennedy could go back home and both say, we succeeded. And for President Kennedy to say to his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, do not describe this as my victory or our victory, was statesmanship of the highest order. So I want to thank Professor Allison for giving us this extraordinary tour. Thank him for his scholarship and all of his contributions.
And I'd say to Nick how grateful we are that we've got a leader of the effort here at Harvard to help reinvent or reinvigorate diplomacy as a first line for advancing and defending American interests. The website for the forum includes a dozen other fantastic forums, if you do Cuban Missile Crisis, where you can see others. We just had to do excerpts from them with much more detail. And as I say about the missile crisis itself, if you go to the Belfer Center's website, you'll find a tab that'll take you off to readings of all kinds, videos of all kinds, where you can listen to the tapes and otherwise. But for a lively discussion, let's say thank you.
Well done. Fantastic.
That was great? Really fun.
But your beautiful bread is still for me.
Oh yeah, you can smell it from here.
In its original condition.
I just wanted to like an hour back, so it's fine.